Okay, I just wanted to make a quick video. There's so many people uh, trying to learn how to measure electronic um, circuits that are pulsed. Now, when you're trying to measure a pulsed DC, this is DC, right? Direct current. So whenever you're trying to measure a high frequency, so let's say that this frequency is 1 millisecond, and it's a very sharp pulse. So the frequency would be let's see. So let's say I've got a waveform, and the waveform has a pulse. There's a big gap, and there's a pulse. There's a gap. So we've got, this is the waveform, right? Got pulse. How do you measure that load? Well, you've got to average it, right? You've got to average. So I can't get it all in. Average. Anyway, so the way you do that is quite simply, you have your power supply going into a large capacitor. Ideally, you want a super capacitor. So let's say that's a super. This is why I use super capacitors on my circuits. By using a super capacitor, you can basically average out that pulse. So let's say that the actual power supply that's supplying this is a power supply coming in. Let's say this is DC coming in, right? You've got positive and negative, but we have a load on the other side, and the load is taking a pulse. So this very sharp pulses out of this capacitor. Now, you don't want to be measuring across the actual pulsed circuit. What you want to be doing is measuring how much power is going into the supercapacitor. That way you will get an average current. You'll get the actual current being consumed, no matter what these pulses are doing, whether or not they're long pulses or short pulses, square wave pulses. You'll get a much better reading to measure on a digital multimeter or even an analog meter. Instead of the needle going like this, which you can't really read that. So instead of a meter that's on current going like that, you'll have a nice steady reading when you're feeding it into the supercapacitor. Because what you're doing is you're taking out power to drive a pulse circuit. And it's been averaged out by the supercapacitor. It's keeping it, it's basically like a snubber, basically. It will keep it even. And all you need to know is how much power is going into the supercapacitor, because whatever you take out the other side will either pull this capacitor down in voltage, or if there's no load, it will go up in voltage slightly. So that's how I do all my electronics measurements. If you looked at all my to do with the Meg, and also to do with even the rotary systems, I always try to use my supercapacitors to average the current out so that we don't get strange readings. So that's basically all it is. Now the resistor there is simply, well, I should have drawn that in, but that is simply our load. So that's simply our load. I should have brought this down. So our load could be a circuit that's sending pulses to a coil. It could be a switch mode power supply. It could be anything really. But if you're drawing current out and it's being pulsed, you need some means of stabilizing the input so you can measure the current that's going in to this supercapacitor. Obviously, you would have there'll be a connection between the supercapacitor and the input side, where you would be measuring how much current is going into the supercapacitor. So yeah, that's the simplest way of measuring variable pulsed DC circuits. And I just wanted to do that, explain that, because there's so many people out there who say, well, they don't know how to measure it, or they don't know how to measure pulsed DC, but it's really quite simple if you just apply a little bit of basic common sense. You simply need to average out the load, and you use a capacitor. That's all there is to it. So the capacitor basically stores the DC and those pulses, depending on how big those pulses are, how wide those pulses are, how many milliseconds, or it could be 50 milliseconds, it could be 1 millisecond, but ultimately you are drawing power out of this capacitor, and that capacitor, that power has to come from somewhere, and you're just measuring the average current that's going in to keep that capacitor reservoir at the point where it has sufficient power to maintain the circuit that you're driving. That's all it is, basically. That's simple. Thanks for watching.